Good morning. Konnichiwa. I wanted to talk today about editors. And before I started, I thought, before I sort of introduce any bias, I'd like to do a survey of the audience. I'd like to understand which people use Emacs, which people use VI, and which people use the rest. So I'm going to get you to just raise a hand.
And Emacs, VI.
Yes. And I'll...
まず Emacs を使ってるから。
あら。OK。
はい、次 VI 系のさんから。
OK, you guys are all model.
OK。
で、あとはそれ以外のさんから。
Oh, I use camera.
That doesn't count. Thank you.
So it's okay to use both, right?
You have to like one. So I wanted to talk about a third editor. A third editor that Perl should have but doesn't, which is an editor for normal people. Because all of you, the VI and Emacs, Perl otaku. You're all crazy people. Normal people do not use text mode editors. They use Visual Studio and they use Eclipse and they use much more rich things. People that don't know how to program as well, often. Unless you're in C#, in which case everything is Visual Studio. So I thought rather than just go through some boring history slides, I'd just show it to you. Oops. All right. I also apologize, I know no Japanese, but my software does. So I'm going to try and do the entire demonstration only in Japanese mode. So this is Padre. It is a fairly conventional editor IDE. It has all the usual stuff that you might want. It has normal like searching, it has filtering, so I want to show. Right, all the tools are fairly well done. No. All right, bunch of your standard things. It does a few things that are a bit different. It does things a bit more Perlishly, and I'll get to some of those later. But basically, it's real and it exists now, and it's ready to start using. You can install it from CPAN. It's a couple of versions away from being 1.0. But it's close. This is the kind of editor that normal people use. It opens up, it opens files visually, it saves files visually, it has tools that are context aware. It says things like unsave file. It does normal things. So okay. It's really just a text editor with an oversized ego. An IDE is just a text editor that wants to grow up and get big. Why? Why do we need anything other than Emacs or VI? You guys are people that know what they're doing. People that are coming into Perl for the first time do not. We did a survey, a worldwide survey. It's interesting that VI and Emacs is very high here. Worldwide, these are about the percentages. About 35% VI, about 13% Emacs as the #1 editor. The rest use a big mix of other things. None of these have any real traction because they all suck. There needs to be something other than VI and Emacs. There's clearly demand here. 50% of programmers don't want to use VI and Emacs, or they're too complicated, or they can't deal with that mode of thinking. They want something else. So in 2005, when PPI first came out, we had this idea for IntelliJ, a smart Perl editor. And the idea was to take an editor which existed, put some Perl parsing magic on it, and start adding features like method completion and whatever. We tried in 2006 using an editor called Kefra to just add PPI on top. Kefra is a Perl editor, but it failed. It didn't work. Mostly it didn't work because it was retrofitted, and Kefra already had its own ways of thinking about things, and there were some project issues and version control problems, and basically it didn't really go anywhere. And the solution was really to write a new one, but I didn't want to do that. An editor from scratch is a very big job. So time went by. Oh, in doing Kefra, we accidentally created Strawberry Perl because we needed a Perl on Windows, because the idea was to make the editor work on Windows. So we kind of got some benefits. We had Strawberry Perl out of the deal. 2 years go by and nothing has happened. And a Gabor, who is a Hungarian living in Israel, who teaches Perl, mostly in Europe, said, I've had enough. I want to write an entire new IDE from scratch, specifically for newbies. Now that is a really stupid idea, because an IDE is enormous. It is huge. And everyone we told this to said, are you kidding? This is just, it will eat years of your life and no one will use it, and you shouldn't do it. But the idea was compelling enough, and Gabor was just crazy enough to do it anyway. So he started with me and a few others to sort of work out what it would look like. And we came up with 4 ideas, 4 principles for writing an IDE for Perl. Firstly, it's going to be a huge project, right? And you have to prepare for it being a huge project immediately. Eclipse is the same size as all of CPAN, 20 million lines.
Holy shit.
And they release once a year. 45 sub-projects, 1 main project, form a giant release train, and the thing goes out the station. 20 million lines of code. Now, Perl is about, 1 line of Perl is about 5 lines of Java. So a Perl IDE that is very mature should be in the range of about 4 million lines. We know from all of those small editors that if you're not open source, even if you're free, you don't get traction. It just doesn't happen. People use them, but they never really take off. We also know that open source projects, which have 1 or 2 people, don't take off either. They never have the time to chase all of the bugs, all of the features. So you have to plan for a big team from day one. You have to get the project structured to support 20 people working on your editor. It has to be written in the same language as the language that you're working with. It had to be written in Perl. We know this because we've seen the evidence of what happens when you try to write it in something else. There are 2 people in the world that know Java and Perl well enough to work on the Eclipse plugin. It doesn't work. What we want is this sort of virtuous cycle that happens. People find your editor, they install it, they start using it because they know the language that it's written in, they start writing extensions, and they start contributing bug fixes, and then you give them commit and they become big full-on project members and they start pushing promotion of it, and you get this sort of virtuous cycle that lifts the editor. If you write Lisp, you use Emacs, full stop. If you write Java, you use Eclipse, full stop. So if you're going to write an IDE, which will be the IDE, it needs to be written in Perl, because you need the people. You have to be very careful about the focus of your editor. Making an editor just to demonstrate one cool feature does not work. There are a number of editors out there in the list of ones that people use regularly that only have one killer feature, and they don't go anywhere. Likewise, you can't build the editor to support every language. What happens is you get a little bit of features everywhere, and the editor never really understands your language. None of these editors really understand Perl properly. So you have to say, my language is number one, and every other language is okay, but not as important. It has to be everywhere. It has to install everywhere. And it has to be normal and native everywhere. We know from showing TK Perl applications to business people that use Windows, if it doesn't look like Windows, it's not real. It must look normal. It also has to be easy to install. Some studies were done, scientific studies were done during the Netscape wars that demonstrated that it didn't matter if your product was bad as long as you could install it easily. So we need the IDE to install from CPAN. 100% pass, and it does. It needs to have very low dependencies, or relatively low dependencies, because if it has a lot of dependencies, many more things can go wrong. It has to be packaged natively for every Linux, and it is for about 5 to 10. It needs a Mac OS DMG file, one file. It has an old one, but Mac people don't seem to do a lot of work on installers, and we haven't quite understood why. So there is an old one, and when we get to 1.0, I think there will be a new one. There needs to be a single installer for Windows. There isn't yet, but we will be merging Strawberry and Padre together soon, so that when you install Strawberry Perl, you have an editor immediately. The number one question on the Strawberry Perl support channels is, where is the editor? It's so assumed that it exists that it's almost a bug not to have an editor in the language. It should install on portable sticks. I have a copy of an IDE in my pocket, in my wallet, and it will run Perl and an IDE and all of the tools. So Gabor took it to YAPC EU 2008, and it was notepad.exe, but with a plugin support, and that was all. And in his talk, he famously said, "This is Padre, it can open files, I really need your help." And help started to arrive. So these are the contributors that work on Notepad++, a couple of people, and Emacs, 20 people. After Gabor said, "I need your help," help arrived. We had 10 to 20 people committing every month. And the volume of work was pretty high too. So the amount of commits on Padre during this core period of expansion was higher than Emacs. There's a reasonable amount of diversity. The red line is people that aren't on the core team. Very slow. But some big contributors doing a lot of work. This is for Padre. For all of the plugins, it's more diverse. There's a lot of contributions outside the core team. People writing new tools, different things. So it was going okay. And so far, it's a good editor that nobody uses. And so I wanted to sort of demo where it's at and to help you consider using it, contributing, or at least playing. It's built on Scintilla and SQLite, using WX widgets, so it's native. It uses threads heavily. It's the largest, most complicated threaded Perl application that we know of, and has required a number of changes to Perl to fix thread bugs. It's also the largest user of WX widgets for Perl, and it's required a lot of bugs to be fixed. It works perfectly well on Windows, it works fine on Mac, and it works fine on Linux. And it looks native, mostly. There's a little few idiosyncrasies on the Mac one, but those can be worked out. Most importantly, we wanted an editor that worked for everybody, everywhere in the world, whether or not they knew English. So it works in a lot of languages. The only major language we don't have is Hindi from India. Otherwise, it's been ported to everything. And if you install Padre on a Japanese computer and you run Padre, it comes up in Japanese automatically. You don't have to select. The porting is pretty good. You can see that there is a few small things not finished. This is for new features for the next release. Ishigaki-san has done a wonderful job of keeping this ported. It has live support, because when people are starting, they need humans to help. So if you go to help, you see live support. There is a support channel for Perl in English, and as of yesterday, there is now a live help in Japanese via the Perl Casual IRC channel. I'm told there's better ones, but this is, I think, good enough. It launches a website IRC channel. It has a lot of plugins, and it has very good plugin support. Uh-oh. Trouble. So these are the plugins. These are all the plugins. As you can see, some of them are a bit out of date. The APIs have not all stabilized yet, so they tend to break regularly. Plugins can also be localized, so plugins fully support native languages automatically. You can submit a translation for a plugin and it will work fine. You can build new tools. This is the web GUI, so the web GUI asset stuff, it pulls it down from the website, displays. You can support new languages, so there are language plugins. This is the Perl 6 support. So we have an IDE for Perl 6. At the moment, we just don't have a good installer for Perl 6 on Windows. But on platforms that support Perl 6 easily, more easily, you can get an IDE for Perl 6, basically. I thought I would demo a couple of other things. So, in terms of plugins, there are a bunch of different plugins. The more interesting ones, some of the really good ones are a bit broken. Padre Swarm is real-time collaborative editing. So you can open files on other people's computers and edit them live. And it works. In fact, it comes, of course, with chat, because every IDE should have an IRC client somewhere. And every Padre user sees one global channel. We also use multicast to do a local channel, a physically local channel. So if you're at a conference and on the same multicast segment, you see just the people near you as well. So you can do conference development where you can sit in the audience, ignore a talk, and work on other people's code. Or talks, or lightning talks, or whatever. It has some really interesting stuff now for GUI building. This is WX Form Builder. It's a GUI designer for WX. So you can do graphical design of programs. And Padre supports it natively. So let's Padre. And so here is support for all of the dialogues that Padre has already. So if we pick one, preview, and it will generate the GUI live, complete with method handlers. So we pick a simple one, like the fun dialogue. Oh, that one. And it has some very special hooks. So project tools. So this is a project statistics dialogue. Once we know it looks okay, we can hit generate. Oh, and it's not going to like me for it. Let's try a different one. Okay, bug. I've been fixing bugs while I'm in the audience, so this is the bleeding edge. But it will generate all of, looks like something like this. So it will generate this. So here's the preferences dialog. So this dialog here, with all the different options. And it will generate all of the WX code. And accesses and method stubs. It is almost ready to support full applications, so you just create an FBP file and say new distribution, and it will make a whole program in one go. Plugins support all kinds of things. That is kind of one of the heaviest ones. This is very mouse-based. Does all the XML parsing. And the modules for doing that are also available standalone. So you can build the same sort of tools outside. All right. Ooh. So, I mentioned that the main language, the number one language, needs to have the most focus. So, Padre supports a number of Perl features, or things that the Perl community needs, that nothing else does. Which was a bit silly that I went back in. So, little things are sometimes the most important. So in Padre, we use tabs because we are better. Tabs are clearly superior, but not everyone agrees. So if we take someone else's program, this is Matsuno-san's thing for icons, which, by the way, work properly. And render properly in their help. And if you're crazy enough to use native method calls, work. Don't ask me if the search works. So Matsuno-san clearly likes spaces because he's inferior. If I'm in a project which uses tabs, and I want to type something in, it indents with tabs. If I open up someone else's code, it knows that they don't like tabs, and it just works. It auto-detects the indent rules for each file, so that you never end up with commit, where the commit tabs and spaces collide. It also does really silly things, like, for example, I know that when I write Perl, have to have all things lined up. You know, I have to have all my variables. Right? In Padre, you pick something you want to align with, drag across, and it will just line it up. You don't have to run tidy over the whole thing. You can just little things that seem to make Perl more readable. I want to take this and just line it up. And just do what you mean. It also does a lot of Perl distribution tricks. So this file here, main, is just one file in my project. But it knows where my project is. And I didn't have to tell it. When I open someone else's code, it looks up the directory tree to find the makefile.pl or git.gitignore or anything else it can find. And it automatically assumes that that's where the project is. It knows that Perl files have things like blib and temporary files, and it ignores them anyway, whether or not you have gitignore. It just knows that Perl projects have makefile junk and ignores them immediately. It comes with a variety of tools, and I have to profess at some point that I forget the one that I want the most. There's a lot of cases where you miss one little ending, and it's not going to show it in here, but it will say, can't find closing brace at end of file. So it has very specific tools, like finding the unmatched brace by scanning through the code with PPI and finding where it is. So it tells me that this is the opening brace that matches the missing one at the end. And from there, I know it must be inside here somewhere, and I can locate it. I've spent so much time looking for missing braces. It does selection, like most editors. It has a bunch of refactoring things that are just getting started. So I know some people don't like the pod spread in the middle, so when they take over someone else's code, chunk, it takes all the pod, connects it together, and pushes it to the end. And it's fairly easy to write new and custom additions to this. There's a lot of features that are almost sort of ready to go. At the moment, the main focus is on getting simple things working, like find, and then find, and find. Find in files. Again, it knows that you're in a Perl project, so it puts this to the most likely place that you want to search within. You don't have to keep picking the directory all the time. It does proper regular expressions. It does regular expression search and replace. Like any Perl editor, it has regular expression design tools. And so shortly, it will also have, this is down at the moment, config synchron. So if you have preferences for your editor on one machine, you just log in and it will install the preferences from the other machine onto your new machine. So if you change machines or get a new computer somewhere, you can automatically configure it. And it will configure it live. So when you say download, the widgets will go and reorganize themselves. It will have your color settings, it will have your font size and anything else that you want. And it knows which preferences are host specific versus which preferences are personal. And projects can override them. So projects can define how they want things to work. So let's not go back in this time. It also has a lot of developer tools. It's very easy to work on. It includes little things like being able to run the IDE from the IDE and then know which one's which. It actually knows which is the development one and which is the one that you're using to edit the development one. And it uses different config settings, so it isolates config away. It also, for an editor, has some very interesting developer tools. You can look at the editor live. So let's say I want Padre IDE. And here is the internals of the entire IDE. Every file, everything. If you want to know what's going on in the background, this is the task manager object. This manages all the thread queuing and the thread calls. It's running 8 threads at the moment. The threads are all audited. It knows which jobs have been done in which thread so that it can reuse the same threads for the same tasks. And if I change files here, you can monitor parts of it. So now it's checking. Right? And it's running different jobs. Or I can say, show me the current document. So here's the current document. And when I switch, it keeps tracking. So it's very easy to debug the editor and find problems with it. We also have some specific tools that let you just drop breakpoints in. Let's hope this doesn't crash. Actually, it's not going to work well because this is not a script. But we have a full debugging GUI. Although the design choice is uninspired. The buttons match the names of the command line, which is mostly an ease of use thing. So should you try it? Probably. I think if you're on Windows, it is definitely a better choice. It will shortly come bundled with Strawberry Perl, so that if you want to give Perl to someone and let them learn, it will be a much more smooth on-ramp to Perl. It also, for people who are learning, allows them to do very nice learning tricks. So you can point at a Perl expression and it will give you the documentation. I was really interested by the Perl core documentation port website I heard about yesterday. I think it would be wonderful if this came up in Japanese. That it went to the website, downloaded the documentation for that, and brought it up.
Google Play Store.
Sorry?
I can't find it in the Google Play Store.
Likewise, a lot of things just work. Control click. And you have access offline to all of the Perl documentation, because search.cpan is good, but problematic if there's no internet. If you're on Mac, I would actually be very interested in hearing people's experiences. We know that the Mac port is not as strong. We think it's because Mac people don't like working on GUI tools. They like having a Unix machine where they never have to touch desktop code. But the future of this editor has enough potential that I think that it would go some of the way to displacing most of the Mac tools. It's hard to say. I think until we get a Mac maintainer who could fix some of these bugs and we get packaging support, I think that really needs to be the next step. But I think it's definitely worth playing with at the moment. I think it's definitely worth trying out. I'd be very interested in hearing how much native language support makes a difference, especially for people who are less experienced. In terms of production, we're currently 2 releases from finished. We're doing some final polishing. Again, we need to get the cloud sync stuff working, and then we'll be probably going to 1.0 towards the end of the year, would be my hope, maybe early next year. I think that's all I have in terms of time, like 5 minutes? Yeah, okay, I think we can end there. Does anyone have any questions?
質問等ございますでしょうか。 マイク。
すみません、正規表現エディターっていうのを見せていただけますか。初学者の例えば、教育に使えるようなものなのか見てみたいんですけれど。
You want to see the regs, what is it called?
The regular expression tool?
Yeah.
はい。
And it wants to know if it's something that could be used to teach newbies how to compose regular expressions.
So it certainly has a lot of the basic pieces, so drop them in. So lots of documentation on the individual pieces. And then sorry. Yeah, okay. So the real-time feedback says, well, D, no match. And with substitution, so it's very iterative.
Would you recommend this as a tool for teaching somebody regular?
I think so. I think, in particular, the ability to sort of have each thing described, especially in native. I assume that native means more for some of the really edge case stuff than it does for the common stuff.
やはり基本的にはこう一つ一つのピースが見れるというのはすごく強いことなので、それを教えるという教育の時にも結構お勧めではないかと思います。で、日本語のこのタイプもあるんですね。あるんで、そういった部分も英語で説明があるのと違ってちゃんとそういうエッジケースとかの細かい部分も対応できるはずです。
ありがとうございました。
はい、他に質問がございますか。No questions?
You talked about how many lines of code. How many lines of code is Padre?
今パドレ実際何行ぐらい書かれてるかってします。
Excellent question. Today, 60,439, with a cost of $2 million of developer time. The slot count project, it's just a straight re-implementation of the core logic.
約6万行でその人間性がお金に換算するといくら200万ドルぐらいのエポートをかかっているという感じです。
It would be interesting, now that I'm here, to translate the cost as well into yen.
Into yen?
Automatically.
まあなんだっけ日本の日本円でこのコストが自動的に出るようなことするのも面白いんじゃないかっていう話です。200万ドルって今78円だからいくら100万円え1億6000万円ぐらいだそうです。はい、他に質問ありますか。
Sure.
I was just wondering if the plugins were packaged as Perl modules as well.
Yeah.
プラグインがパールモジュールとしてパッケージ化されているかという。
The ones that are mature are. And once we get to 1.0 and the APIs are frozen, there's still a few corners that move, and so the plugins break. Once the APIs are finally frozen at 1.0, all the plugins will be given time to mature properly. At the moment, we still have the option of breaking plugins every release. But we do know that they're broken. So,
現時点でまだ 1.0 に達してないので、プラグインは少しずつ壊れているケースもありますけど、1.0 になる頃には、全部、きれいになっているはずです。
So, this is the Git support. And part of the plugin interface is that you have to declare which pieces of Padre you use and when the last time was that you know that it didn't break. So you say, well, I know that this worked in this version of Padre. And then, let's say task API. So in Padre task, every class has a back compatibility flag. And when the plugin is loaded, it looks at the interfaces that the plugin declares and then looks at the back compatibility rules for each Padre interface. And if it matches all of them, it allows the plugin to start. If the plugin does not match, we don't start the plugin because it'll just crash.
でプラグインのその API の仕様として、パドレのどの部分を使っているのかっていうのと、あとそのどの場合に使っているのかというのを宣言する部分があって、それにもしマッチしないと、そもそもプラグインは動かなくなってます。もしそれを動かしてしまうとクラッシュしちゃうんで、そもそもロードをタイプして動かさないっていう形です。And I think we're out of time.
Would you take one more question, please?
Quick.
Yeah.
Is there any implementation or plan to implement for one of these things?
No. Well, Strawberry works, sort of.
Really?
Until Strawberry works on those devices, or some form of Perl works on those devices.
I want to power Pro with Siri.
With Siri? Sure.
And Cesios get in my way.
Yeah.
So I want you to help me.
Are you really still using that language, Dan?
If you can give me Perl that works on iPhone, I can investigate.
まあ、タブレットとかそういったもので動くのかという質問ですけど、とりあえず現在はなので、もしそのらのタブレットの上で動くパールが彼の手元にあるのであればやってみてもいいですということでした。はい。じゃあ、あとは、もし質問がございましたら、廊下とかで我々に捕まえてください。はい、ありがとうございました。